There are things a man buries so carefully, so deliberately, so deep, that he eventually mistakes the burial for the thing never having existed at all. Edmund Vane had become very good at this. He had buried the memory of a particular laugh, low, surprised, the kind of laugh that arrived before its owner had decided to allow it. He had buried the memory of a voice reading aloud in his mother's sitting room on winter afternoons, unhurried, with the slight emphasis of someone who genuinely loved the words. He had buried the memory of eyes that had looked at him, in the last moment before their owner walked out of his house and his life, with an expression he had spent 5 years not examining. He had buried all of it. He had told himself, with the conviction of a man who needed very badly to believe something, that it had not been difficult. He had been lying. A quick break. To bring you our stories with higher quality narration, we need your support. Please subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The ballroom of Ravensworth House was full. This was expected. Edmund's annual spring ball was among the most attended events of the London season, a fact that gave him no particular pleasure but which he understood to be useful in the way that many pleasureless things were useful. It kept him visible. It kept him obligated. It gave him somewhere to stand and something to do with his hands and a reason, every April, to open the house that had been too quiet for 5 years and fill it briefly with noise. He stood near the top of the stairs, receiving guests with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this since he was 19 and had long since stopped needing to think about it. Names, faces, the correct degree of warmth for each, an old friend warranted one thing, a business acquaintance another, a hopeful mother with a marriageable daughter a third. Edmund navigated all of it with the smooth efficiency of someone moving through familiar water. He was not thinking about her. He had not been thinking about her. He had, in fact, spent 5 years becoming exceptionally skilled at not thinking about her, and tonight was no different from any other night, and he was perfectly. Lord Ashby, Norris announced from the top of the stairs, and Miss Cecily Hartwell. The name hit him like a hand pressed flat against his chest. Edmund did not move. He was almost certain he did not move. But something happened, some infinitesimal stillness, some fractional arrest of breath, because the man beside him, Lord Fellows, turned and said, "Vane? Are you quite?" "Perfectly well," Edmund said. And looked up. She was at the top of the stairs. 5 years. He had last seen her 5 years ago, in this house, in the corridor outside his mother's rooms, on a grey November morning when he had said things that could not be unsaid and she had listened to all of them without a word and then simply left. Walked down those stairs and out of that door and into a morning that had closed around her like water. 5 years, and here she was at the top of his stairs with her hand on another man's arm, and Edmund Vane, who had buried everything, discovered in the space of approximately 3 seconds that he had buried nothing at all. She looked different, and exactly the same. That was the only honest way to describe it. The girl he remembered had been composed but uncertain, careful in the way of someone who understood her position and its fragility. This woman was composed in an entirely different way, not careful, not uncertain, but settled. The composure of someone who has been through something and come out the other side and made their peace with what the crossing cost. She was wearing deep blue. Her hair was dressed simply. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the ballroom with the expression of someone who has prepared for something difficult and found, upon arrival, that they have prepared correctly. Lord Ashby, Edmund knew him, had known him for years, a good man, a decent man. Edmund had always thought so and found at this precise moment that he resented this quality intensely, leaned down and said something in her ear. Cecily smiled. The smile did not reach her eyes, but it was a real smile nonetheless, the smile of someone who is grateful for kindness even when kindness is not quite enough. They descended the stairs. Edmund watched them come. He had approximately 15 seconds. He used them to reconstruct every wall he had ever built and discovered that walls, when you need them most, are never quite as solid as they seemed in the building. Lord Ashby. Edmund extended his hand. His voice was, he checked it, quickly, the way one checks a surface for cracks, steady. I didn't know you were in London. Arrived last week, Ashby said, shaking his hand with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who had nothing to be uncomfortable about. Couldn't miss your ball, could I? He glanced beside him. You know Miss Hartwell, I believe? She was, previously in your household, I understand. Previously in your household. 5 years reduced to a social formula. Tidy. Bloodless. The language of people who understand that difficult histories must be made navigable in drawing rooms. Edmund looked at Cecily. Cecily looked at him. He had thought, in the 15 seconds on the stairs, that perhaps time and distance had altered the specific quality of her gaze, that what he remembered had been sharpened by guilt into something more affecting than the reality. He had thought this, and he had been wrong, because her eyes were exactly as he remembered them, direct, and clear, and containing, at this particular moment, absolutely nothing that she had not chosen to put there. She was not angry. She was not cold. She was not trembling with suppressed emotion. She was simply, present. Composed. Looking at him the way one looks at a thing one has thoroughly finished with and therefore no longer needs to feel anything in particular about. Edmund had not known, until this moment, that the absence of feeling could be more difficult to bear than its presence. Miss Hartwell, he said. Your Grace. She curtsied, correctly, properly, at exactly the depth appropriate to his rank and their acquaintance. No more, no less. Thank you for the invitation. Of course, he said. And that was it. Ashby drew her into the room, into the noise and light of the ballroom, and Edmund watched them go and stood very still for a moment among the flow of arriving guests and thought about the fact that she had thanked him for the invitation as though she were any guest, any ordinary guest, as though she had not once sat in this house every day for 2 years and read to his mother and argued with his housekeeper about the flower arrangements and laughed that low, surprised laugh in the corridor. Outside the library when she thought no one could hear. Thank you for the invitation. Vain. Fellows again, at his elbow, concerned now. You look as though you've seen a ghost. Edmund looked at him. I'm perfectly well, he said, for the second time that evening. Fellows did not look convinced. Edmund turned back to the arriving guests and did not allow himself to look at the ballroom. He lasted approximately 4 minutes. He found her near the far windows. He had not decided to find her. He had decided, with great firmness, to remain at his post near the stairs and perform his obligations as host and under no circumstances cross the ballroom to the far windows where Cecily Hartwell was standing with a glass of champagne she was not drinking, looking out at the garden with the expression of a woman who has excused herself from a conversation and is taking a moment that belongs entirely to herself. He crossed the ballroom. She heard him coming, or sensed him, perhaps, the specific quality of his approach, because she turned before he was close enough for it to have been sound. Something moved across her face, too quick to name, there and gone, and then the composure was back, smooth and complete. Your Grace, she said. The garden looks the same, he said. It was not what he had intended to say. He was not certain what he had intended to say, but it was not that. Cecily looked at the garden. Does it? The roses are a week early this year. My groundskeeper is inexplicably proud of this. He should be, Cecily said. They're beautiful. A pause. The ballroom moved around them, music, voices, the particular warm noise of 100 people in an expensive room, and Edmund stood at the window and looked at the side of Cecily Hartwell's face and said nothing, because everything he might have said had the quality of things that could not be said here, in this room, at this party, in front of these people. You look well, he said at last. Cecily turned from the window and looked at him directly. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." The politeness of it, the perfect, careful, deliberately chosen politeness, was worse than anything else she could have said. "Cecily." "Miss Hartwell," she said. Quietly. Not sharply. That would have been something, that would have been feeling, that would have been a door left slightly open. This was simply a correction. A closing. Edmund stopped. "Miss Hartwell," he said. Across the room, Lord Ashby was making his way toward them, not with suspicion, not with urgency, simply with the natural movement of a man returning to the woman he loved after a brief absence. "I believe Lord Ashby is looking for you," Edmund said. "Yes," Cecily said. She set down her untouched glass of champagne with the precision of someone placing a full stop at the end of a sentence. "Good evening, Your Grace." She left. Edmund stood at the window and watched Lord Ashby reach her, watched him offer his arm, watched her take it, watched them move back into the warmth and noise of the ballroom together, and felt the specific weight of a man standing in a room full of people he had invited into his house, in which he had buried something very carefully for 5 years, discovering that the ground had shifted. He had spoken her name tonight. Norris had spoken it first, at the top of the stairs, with the indifferent professionalism of a man reading from a list. But Edmund had spoken it too, Cecily, one syllable, one unguarded moment, before she had corrected him and closed the door. 5 years of not saying it. And now that he had, he understood, with the cold, clear, unwelcome certainty of a man who has run out of room to lie to himself, that the burial had never taken. It had never taken at all. A quick break. To bring you our stories with higher quality narration, we need your support. Please subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Later, when the last guest had gone and the house had settled into its post-ball quiet, candles guttering, flowers beginning to droop, the particular exhausted silence of a room that has held 100 people and now holds none, Edmund stood in the empty ballroom and looked at the far windows. The garden beyond them was dark. He thought about the expression on her face when she had looked at him at the top of the stairs, that brief, unguarded thing, there and gone before he could name it. He had been a man of considerable observation for 34 years and he knew what things looked like when they were truly finished. That had not looked finished. That had looked like something that had been very carefully, very deliberately, very painstakingly, buried. She learned it from somewhere, he thought, with a humorlessness that was almost funny. He picked up her untouched glass of champagne from the windowsill where she had left it. Looked at it for a moment. Set it back down. He owed her something, something that was not an apology, though an apology was part of it. Something larger than that. Something that would require him to say, out loud, not just "I was wrong but here is what my being wrong cost you," which was a considerably more difficult thing and which he had been avoiding. He understood now, since the winter morning he had learned the truth. He had been rehearsing an apology. He had not yet been ready to reckon. He was beginning to think he was going to have to become ready. The ballroom was very quiet. Somewhere in London, in whatever house Lord Ashby had let for the season, Cecily Hartwell was, doing what? Sitting by a window? Reading? Lying awake with the particular wakefulness of someone who has survived a difficult evening and is now accounting for it in the dark? Were you always this unknowable, he thought, or did I make you this way? He already knew the answer. He turned off the last lamp and went upstairs, and the name that he had not spoken for 5 years moved through the dark house with him, quiet and persistent, refusing, as it turned out, to be buried after all. The winter he learned the truth, Edmund had been in the middle of a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. This was the detail that stayed with him afterward, not the content of what he'd learned, not the face of the woman who had told him, but the sheer mundanity of what had preceded it. He had been reviewing tenant accounts. He had been drinking coffee that had gone slightly cold. He had been thinking, with a portion of his mind, about whether the north field drainage needed attention before spring. And then Mrs. Poole had appeared in his study doorway, Mrs. Poole, who had been a housemaid at Ravensworth House for 30 years and had retired to a cottage on the estate grounds, and whom Edmund had always liked for her directness, and she had said that she needed to tell him something. That she had needed to tell him something for a long time. That she had been, she said, with the careful emphasis of a woman choosing her words around a weight she had carried for years, not herself when it happened, and she was sorry, and she needed him to know. Edmund had set down his cold coffee. And Mrs. Poole had told him about the Musaverlery. He had been 29 when it happened. His mother had been ill for 2 years by then, a slow, gentle decline, the kind that gives you time to prepare and then turns out not to have prepared you at all. She had wanted company. Not nurses, not the efficient care of people performing a duty, but company, someone to sit with her in the afternoons, to read to her, to talk about things that weren't her health. Edmund had arranged it. He had found Cecily Hartwell through a recommendation from his mother's own physician, a clergyman's daughter, the physician said, very well read, recently in need of a position, entirely suitable. Cecily had arrived on a Tuesday in October and had been, within a fortnight, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of his mother's days that the Dowager Duchess spoke of her at dinner with a warmth she reserved for very few people. Edmund had noticed her. He had noticed her in the way that a man notices something he is not prepared to act on, cataloguing it carefully, keeping it at a considered distance, telling himself that the distance was appropriate and proper and had nothing to do with the fact that proximity felt dangerous in a way he couldn't quite account for. She was in his employ. She was dependent on his household. The power differential was not something he was willing to ignore. He had been, he thought now, looking back from the cold distance of 5 years and the colder distance of knowing what he knew, genuinely trying to do the right thing. And then the Musaverlery had gone missing. His mother's sapphires. A brooch, 2 rings, a necklace that had been in the family for 4 generations. His mother had been distressed in the particular way of someone whose illness had already taken so much and who finds the loss of an object, even a thing, one diminishment too many. The household had been questioned. Edmund had conducted it himself, with a thoroughness that he had believed at the time was fairness and understood now was something else, the thoroughness of a man looking for a specific answer and calling the search impartial. It had been a housemaid named Clara who had said, with the wide eyes of someone performing innocence rather than possessing it, "I saw Miss Hartwell near your mother's jewelry box, Your Grace. The morning before they went missing. I didn't want to say, but..." Edmund had believed her. He had believed her immediately and completely, with the efficiency of a man who had been looking for a reason and had been handed one. He had not asked himself why he believed her so readily. He had not asked himself what Cecily might have said in her own defense. He had not, in fact, given Cecily the opportunity to say anything at all. He had sent for her. He had told her what Clara had reported. He had watched her face, watched the color drain from it, watched something that he had called guilt and understood now, 5 years later, had been shock. The specific shock of a person who has been accused of something by someone they trusted and cannot, in the first moment, find the words for the wrongness of it. She had not defended herself. This was the thing he had returned to most often in the years after, the thing that had allowed him, when the guilt became difficult, to reconstruct the story in a way that absolved him. She didn't defend herself. As though innocence always announces itself loudly. As though a person, confronted with a betrayal of that magnitude by a man whose good opinion they had, he knew she had, he had always known, he had catalogued that too from a careful distance, would naturally find the words. She had said, "I see." 2 words. Then she had looked at him, that expression he had spent 5 years not examining, and she had left. She had been gone from the house within the hour. The sapphires had been found 3 months later in Clara's belongings, when Clara was dismissed for an unrelated matter and the housekeeper conducted the standard inventory. Edmund had not told anyone. He had told himself this was because there was nothing to be done. Cecily was gone, her whereabouts unknown, the damage irreversible. He had told himself it would serve no purpose. He had been lying about this too. Mrs. Poole, in the cottage on the estate grounds, had been Clara's aunt. She had known. Not immediately, Clara had not confessed to her immediately, but within a year she had known, and had said nothing, because Clara was her niece and she had not been, as she told Edmund in his study on that ordinary Tuesday in winter, herself. "I should have come to you sooner," Mrs. Poole said. She was 71 years old and she looked every year of it, which Edmund suspected had less to do with age than with what she had been carrying. "I know I should have. But Clara is gone now." A pause, the particular pause of a woman naming something that still hurt, "and I am old, and I find I cannot keep it any longer." Edmund had sat very still behind his desk. "Where is she?" he had said. "Miss Hartwell." "Do you know?" Mrs. Poole did not know. Edmund had found out. It had taken 2 weeks, a solicitor, and the particular embarrassment of a man discovering that the woman he had wronged had been, in the intervening years, entirely findable if one had bothered to look. She was in Wiltshire. She was running a small school. She was, by all accounts, doing so with considerable success. Edmund had written a letter. He had written 7 drafts of the letter. He had sent none of them. Instead he had sat with the knowledge all winter, the knowledge of what had happened, what he had done, what she had survived in the doing of it, and had felt, with a thoroughness that he considered appropriate and insufficient in equal measure, absolutely terrible. And then spring had come. And the season had come. And Lord Ashby had walked into his ballroom with Cecily Hartwell on his arm. The morning after the ball, Edmund sat in his study with the tenant account still open on his desk from the previous afternoon, untouched. He was thinking about her face at the top of the stairs. Not the composed face, the face she had shown him, the face she had prepared for the occasion with the meticulous care of a woman who understood that she was walking into a difficult room and intended to walk through it upright. That face he had looked at all evening. The other face. The one that had been there for approximately half a second before the prepared one arrived. At the top of his stairs, in his ballroom, when Norris had announced her name and she had looked up and found him already looking at her. He had been trying, since the previous night, to name what he had seen in it. Not anger. He had expected anger, had in some ways hoped for it, because anger was a response he knew how to meet. Not coldness, that had come after, that was the prepared face. Not recognition, he thought. That was what it was. The specific expression of someone seeing a thing they have thought about, carefully, repeatedly, in the dark, and finding it suddenly present in front of them in the daylight. Not surprise. Not pleasure. Just recognition. The expression of someone who has been carrying a thing for so long that the thing itself, encountered unexpectedly, feels almost familiar. He understood it because he had felt it himself. Looking up and finding her at the top of his stairs. She thought about me, he realized. She has thought about this, about what this would be like, what she would do, how she would manage it. She prepared for this. For me. This should not have moved him. He found that it moved him considerably. He went to his mother's sitting room. He rarely went there anymore. It had been kept exactly as she had left it, which was a choice he had made without examining it very closely, and which he understood, standing in the doorway, said something about him that he wasn't entirely comfortable with. The chair by the window. That was where his mother had sat in the afternoons. And beside it, a smaller chair, slightly angled toward the window, the chair where Cecily had sat and read aloud on winter afternoons when the light was good. He had stood in this doorway and listened, sometimes. He had not let himself go in. He had stood in the doorway and listened to her voice and told himself this was the appropriate distance and ignored, with great discipline, everything that the discipline was costing him. You were afraid, he thought now. Not of her. Of what she represented, the specific vulnerability of being known by someone, of having allowed someone close enough to see you clearly, of the risk that entailed. And when Clara had come with her wide eyes and her convenient accusation, he had believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative. The alternative being, trust her. Choose her. Stand in the corridor and say I don't believe this, I know you, I know what you are, and this is not it. He had not trusted her. He had not chosen her. He had taken the easier thing and called it principle. Edmund stood in the doorway of his mother's sitting room and looked at the smaller chair by the window for a long time. Then he went back to his study. He had a letter to write, not the 7 drafts of the winter, not the apology he had rehearsed, not the explanation of what had happened to him. Something different. Something that would require him to ask, for the first time, what had happened to her. London in the season had a particular quality of inescapability. This was, Cecily had always thought, both its greatest flaw and its most useful feature. You could not avoid people in London in May. The same faces appeared at the same breakfasts and the same afternoon calls and the same evening assemblies with the regularity of a very well-organized haunting, and if one of those faces happened to belong to a man you had spent 5 years learning not to think about, well, London did not particularly care about your feelings on the matter. London simply scheduled another dinner party and put you next to him. She had known he would be here. This was the thing she had not told anyone, not Lord Ashby, who knew the outline of what had happened and had been, with the characteristic decency that had made her say yes when he asked, careful never to press for more than she offered. Not her friend Margaret, who had written from Wiltshire asking how the season was going and to whom Cecily had replied with careful cheerfulness. Not even herself, entirely, in the daylight hours when she was busy and purposeful and had no need to examine things. In the dark, though. In the quiet. She had known. She had known from the moment Lord Ashby had mentioned, 6 weeks ago in Wiltshire, that he intended to attend the Ravensworth Spring Ball, and hadn't she heard the name before, wasn't there some connection? She had felt the knowledge settle into her like cold water and had said, very calmly, yes, I believe I was employed in that household some years ago. Some years ago. As though it were a footnote. As though it were a mild geographical fact about her past, like having once lived in Bath or having learned French from a particular tutor. She had spent the subsequent 6 weeks preparing. She had prepared the face, the composed, courteous, entirely finished face that she had worn all evening at the ball and which had cost her, if she was being truthful with herself in the small hours of the morning after, rather more than she had budgeted for. She had not prepared for the half-second at the top of the stairs. She had prepared for many things. She had not prepared for the specific experience of looking up and finding him already looking at her, not with the careful social attention of a host monitoring his guests, but with something unguarded and unmanaged, the expression of a man who has been struck by something before he had time to decide how to receive it. She had not prepared for that. She had recovered quickly. She was good at recovering quickly, 5 years had made her very good at it. But in the carriage afterward, with Lord Ashby beside her talking comfortably about the evening, Cecily had sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out at the dark London streets and thought, he looked at me like that. She did not know what to do with like that. She had been doing quite well, for 5 years, not knowing what to do with it, and she intended to continue. The problem with London in the season was that intention and execution were 2 entirely different things. She saw him 4 times in the first week after the ball. The first time was at Lady Carrington's afternoon reception, where he arrived late and she was already leaving, and they exchanged a nod across the entrance hall that was so carefully calibrated in its neutrality that it almost made her laugh. The second time was at the opera, where they were in adjacent boxes, not adjoining, but close enough that in the interval she was aware, with the precision of someone trying very hard not to be aware, of exactly where he was standing and who he was talking to and whether he had glanced in her direction. He had glanced twice. She had not looked back. The third time was at the Marchioness of Ely's dinner, which was where London's inescapability became a genuine problem, because the Marchioness of Ely had a seating plan that placed Cecily and Edmund on the same side of the table, 4 seats apart, close enough to be in the same conversation and far enough to make that conversation require some effort. The effort was made. The conversation was had, about the opera, about the weather, about a new exhibition at the Royal Academy, about nothing whatsoever of any significance. Edmund was courteous. Cecily was courteous. Lord Ashby, seated across the table, was blissfully courteous about everyone. Cecily ate her soup and kept her expression pleasant and noticed, with the part of her mind she could not entirely discipline, that Edmund ate almost nothing and spent a portion of the meal looking at his plate with the focused inattention of a man conducting an internal argument. She did not ask herself what the argument was about. She was fairly certain she knew. The fourth time was at Hyde Park. She was walking with Lord Ashby on a Tuesday afternoon, the fashionable hour, the fashionable path, the fashionable parade of London society performing its ritual of being seen, when Edmund appeared coming from the opposite direction, alone, on horseback. He saw them from perhaps 30 yards away. Cecily watched him see them, watched the slight adjustment in his posture, the decision being made, and then he had drawn his horse to a stop beside them with the ease of a man who had decided something and intended to act on it. "Ashby," he said, with genuine warmth. Then, "Miss Hartwell." "Your Grace," Cecily said. Lord Ashby, who possessed the social ease of a man entirely at peace with himself and others, launched into conversation with Edmund with the uncomplicated pleasure of two old friends unexpectedly meeting. They talked about horses. Edmund's mare had thrown a shoe that morning, Ashby had a recommendation for a farrier in Mayfair, and Cecily stood beside her fiancé and listened and watched Edmund Vane talk about horses. He was different in this, she noticed. Not the managed public version, not the host at the top of the stairs, not the careful dinner party participant. This was easier. This was a man who had known Ashby for years and was talking to him without thinking about it, and the ease of it showed in the set of his shoulders and the way he gestured slightly with one hand when he made a point and the way he almost smiled at something Ashby said, almost, not quite, not the full thing, but the suggestion of it. She remembered that almost smile. She had filed it away, 5 years ago, as one of the small private observations of someone who had spent 2 years in close proximity to a person and had learned the specific vocabulary of their expressions, the almost smile, the slight furrow when he was thinking, the particular stillness when something had genuinely interested him. "Stop," she told herself. She stopped. "Don't you think, Miss Hartwell?" She looked up. Both men were looking at her. Ashby with the fond attention of someone including the person they loved in a conversation. Edmund with something more careful, an alertness, a watching. "I'm sorry," she said pleasantly. "I was distracted by the park." "What was the question?" "Only whether you preferred the east or west path," Ashby said. Edmund was recommending the west. "The roses are apparently spectacular this year." "The west path," Cecily said. "By all means." Edmund looked at her, just for a moment, just slightly longer than courtesy required, and Cecily looked back at him with her composed face and gave him nothing. "Enjoy the roses," he said. And rode on. He found her that evening. She had known he would, had felt it coming with the inevitability of weather, the sense of pressure building towards something that could not be indefinitely deferred. She was at the Viscount Hearn's card party, in the smaller sitting room off the main gallery, having excused herself from a game of whist on the grounds of a headache, which was not entirely untrue. She heard him before she saw him, those footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had made a decision. He came into the room and closed the door behind him. Not improper, the door was not fully closed, the party was audible beyond it, they were in a house full of people. But deliberate. The closing of a man who wanted a conversation rather than a performance. Cecily stood by the window. She seemed, she noted with dry internal amusement, to spend a great deal of time standing by windows in his vicinity, and turned to face him. "Your Grace," she said. "I wrote you a letter," he said. "In January. 7 drafts of it." A pause. "I sent none of them." Cecily looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you should know that I tried." He held her gaze. "And that the trying was inadequate." "And that I have been aware, since January, that it was inadequate, and have not yet found a way to make it otherwise." The room was quiet. Beyond the door, faintly, voices and the sound of cards. "What did the letter say?" Cecily asked. "That I was wrong. That I know what it cost you. That I am—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. The internal argument she had observed at dinner arrived now at its conclusion. "They said that I was sorry. All 7 of them. They were very thorough about being sorry." "But?" Cecily said. He looked at her with the directness that she had always found the most difficult thing about him, the quality of his attention when he chose to deploy it fully, without management. "But sorry is what happened to me," he said. "It doesn't touch what happened to you." The silence that followed was different from any silence they had shared in the previous week, not the careful, managed silence of 2 people maintaining appropriate distance, but something more exposed than that. The silence of something having been said that could not be unsaid and that did not, Cecily found, feel like a door being forced open so much as a door that had been there all along, and had just been acknowledged. She had prepared for the apology. She had constructed, in the 6 weeks before the season and the days after the ball, her response to the apology, correct, composed, closing. "I accept your apology, Your Grace. I wish you well." Clean. Final. She had not prepared for this. "No," she said at last. "It doesn't." He nodded, not with relief, she noticed, but with the sober acknowledgement of a man receiving something he had earned rather than something he had hoped for. "I would like," he said carefully, "to ask you what happened after you left." A pause. "If you are willing to tell me." Cecily studied him, this man who had looked at her at the top of his stairs with an unguarded expression she had been trying not to think about, who had written 7 letters and sent none of them, who had just said the most difficult and honest thing he could have said and looked as though the saying of it had cost him something real. "I am not willing," she said, "to have that conversation here." Something shifted in his expression, not quite hope, but adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has been told not here and is noting, carefully, that this is different from not ever. "No," he said. "Of course not. Good evening, Your Grace." She walked past him to the door. "Miss Hartwell." She stopped. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "Of what I was thinking 5 years ago." "Why he stopped. "You deserve to know why." Cecily stood with her hand near the door and looked at the middle distance and thought about the word deserve. She had thought about it a great deal over the past 5 years, what she deserved, what had been taken, what could and could not be recovered. She had made her peace with most of it. She had built something good from the wreckage, and she was not nothing, and Lord Ashby was a kind man, and she had a life that was hers. She had made her peace with most of it. You owe me nothing, Your Grace, she said quietly. You made yourself perfectly clear 5 years ago. She left. She did not look back. But in the carriage home, with Lord Ashby's hand warm over hers and the London streets moving past the window, Cecily Hartwell stared at the dark and thought about 7 letters that had never been sent, and found, with a clarity she would have preferred not to have, that she was furious. Not the cold, buried fury of someone who has accepted a wound and learned to carry it. The hot, present, entirely inconvenient fury of someone whose wound has just been prodded back into feeling. She was furious. Which meant, she understood, pressing her fingers quietly together in the dark of the carriage, that she had not made her peace with it at all. She had simply made her silence. The letter he finally sent was 4 lines long. Edmund had written it at 6 in the morning, 2 days after the Herne card party, in the particular clarity that arrives after a night of not sleeping. He had not drafted it. He had not revised it. He had written it once, in the knowledge that revision was how he had spent January producing 7 letters that said everything correctly and nothing truly, and that correctness was not what was required. Miss Hartwell. I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you, not at a party, not across a dinner table, but properly. I am aware that I am asking more than I have a right to ask. I am asking anyway. Ravensworth. He had sent it before he could think about it. Her reply arrived that afternoon. 3 lines. Your Grace. Hyde Park. The West Path, since you recommended it. Thursday at 11, if Lord Ashby has no prior claim on my morning. He does not. Edmund had read it 4 times. He had spent the subsequent 48 hours preparing what he intended to say, which was, he understood this, he was clear-eyed about it, the same mistake he had made in January, and he made it anyway, because some habits were too deeply grooved to break on principle alone. Thursday was cold for May. The kind of cold that arrives in the middle of spring as a reminder that warmth is conditional, pale sun, sharp wind, the roses on the West Path technically blooming but doing so with a certain grim determination rather than joy. Edmund arrived 10 minutes early and stood on the path and looked at the roses and thought about what he was going to say. He had it prepared. It was good. It was honest and complete, and it covered the ground thoroughly, what he had been thinking, why he had believed Clara so readily, the fear underneath the belief, the cowardice underneath the fear. He had examined himself without flattery and rendered the examination into words, and he was ready. Cecily arrived exactly at 11. She was wearing grey, a sensible walking dress, her hair simply dressed, no concessions to impressiveness. She looked like someone who had decided, deliberately, to attend this meeting as herself rather than as any particular version of herself. Edmund found this, for reasons he didn't immediately examine, more difficult to face than elaborate preparation would have been. Your Grace, she said. Miss Hartwell. Thank you for coming. You asked, she said simply. And waited. Edmund began his prepared remarks. He got through approximately 4 minutes of them before he noticed her face. She was listening. That was the thing, she was genuinely listening, with the focused attention she had always given to things that mattered, and she was not interrupting, and she was not looking away, and her expression was the composed, careful expression he had come to know over the past 2 weeks. But underneath it, in the set of her mouth, in the slight quality of stillness in her eyes, was something that Edmund, for minutes into his prepared remarks, identified with a lurch of cold recognition as, she has heard this before. Not from him. From herself. In the dark of wherever she had been for 5 years, rehearsing what he might someday say, building the shape of the apology from its probable materials so that when it arrived it would not be able to surprise her. He stopped mid-sentence. Cecily looked at him. Your Grace? I'm doing it again, he said. A pause. I beg your pardon. The letters, he said. January. I wrote 7 letters that were very thorough and very honest and entirely about me. He looked at her directly. This is the same thing. Different words. Same architecture. Cecily said nothing. But something shifted, fractionally, in her expression, not the composed face, not the finished face, but something underneath both of those. The expression of someone who has been handed an unexpected truth and is deciding what to do with it. What were you going to say? She asked. That I believed Clara because I wanted to, he said. Because there was something between us that I had been refusing to act on, and the accusation was a clean way out of it. A reason to put distance between us that I didn't have to take responsibility for. He held her gaze. I told myself I was being principled. I was being a coward. And I knew the difference, and I chose the coward's version, and I have known that since approximately 3 months after you left and have been, living with that knowledge, ever since. The roses moved slightly in the cold wind. Cecily looked at him for a long moment. That is more honest than I expected, she said at last. It is the least I owe you. Yes, she said. It is. A pause. Then, and Edmund had not expected this, had not prepared for this, had no version of this in his careful 48 hours of preparation, Cecily turned and began walking slowly along the path, and after a moment's surprised stillness he fell into step beside her. They walked in silence for a moment. You said there was something between us, Cecily said. She was looking at the path ahead, not at him. That you had been refusing to act on it. Yes. Did you think I didn't know that? Edmund looked at her profile. No, he said. I think you knew. I knew, she said quietly. I had known for some time. And I had also made my peace with the fact that you were not going to act on it. That it was going to remain, she paused, searching for the word, unspoken. And I had accepted that. I had made my arrangement with it. And then Clara, Edmund said. And then Clara. Cecily's voice was even. And you didn't ask me a single question. No. Not one. She stopped walking. Turned to look at him, and this was not the composed face, this was not the prepared face, this was something that had been underneath both of those for 2 weeks and had now, on a cold May morning on the west path of Hyde Park, decided to surface. You looked at me, you, who had been in that house for 2 years, who had spoken to me every day, who had, she stopped. Collected herself. You looked at me and you believed it. Immediately. Without asking. Edmund held her gaze. Yes. Why? She said. Not the cowardice. I understand the cowardice. Why didn't you ask? One question. Did you take them? That is all it would have taken. The question landed with the precision of something that had been waiting a long time to be asked. Because, Edmund said, and found, to his own cost, that this was the part he had not prepared, the part underneath the prepared part, the part that the 48 hours of careful honest self-examination had not quite reached, because I was afraid of the answer. Cecily looked at him. Not that you had taken them, he said. I don't think I truly believed you had. I was afraid, he stopped. Started again. If I asked and you said no, I would have had to believe you. And if I believed you, I would have had to stand in that corridor and say so. In front of the household. Against Clara's word. For you. He looked at her steadily. And that would have required me to declare something. About what you were to me. About what I was willing to do on your behalf. The cold wind moved through the roses. And you weren't willing, Cecily said. I was terrified, he said. Which is not the same thing, but which produced the same result, and you bore the cost of it, and I understand that those are not equivalent. Cecily looked at him for a long moment, the longest moment, Edmund thought, since the top of the stairs, since the half-second of recognition before the composed face arrived. Then she turned and began walking again. Edmund walked beside her. They were quiet for a while. The park moved around them, other walkers, the distant sound of horses, a child somewhere laughing. The ordinary machinery of a London morning, indifferent to the weight of what was being said on the West Path. "I accept your apology," Cecily said at last. Her voice was quiet and level and entirely sincere. "I want you to know that I mean that. I'm not saying it to close the conversation." "I know," Edmund said. "But an apology," she continued, "explains what happened to you, Your Grace. It tells me what you were thinking and feeling and afraid of. It is honest and I believe it and I do accept it." She paused. "It does not explain what happened to me." Edmund said nothing. Because this was the thing he had been circling for 4 minutes of prepared remarks and the rest of this conversation, that he had not yet asked. Had not asked in January. Had not asked in any of the 7 letters. Had not, if he was being fully honest, allowed himself to ask, because asking would require him to know, and knowing would require him to hold the full weight of it, and he had been managing the weight carefully, doling it out to himself in quantities he could handle. She ran a school, he knew. She was in Wiltshire. She was fine. He had told himself she was fine. He had used her fineness, her evident survival, her evident capability, as a kind of permission not to look too closely at the cost of the surviving. "I haven't asked," he said. "No," Cecily said. "I want to ask." She glanced at him, sideways, brief. "Not here," she said. It was exactly what she had said at the Herne card party, and it meant, Edmund thought, exactly what it had meant then, not a closing, but a deferral. A not yet rather than a never. He nodded. They walked the length of the West Path in silence after that, past the roses that were blooming with grim determination, past the other walkers, past the ordinary London morning, and when they reached the gate where Lord Ashby was waiting with 2 horses and his uncomplicated warmth, Cecily rejoined him with a smile that was real and a composure that was real and something behind both of those that Edmund suspected only he could see. He rode home alone. He sat in his study and looked at the tenant accounts and did not see them. He had apologized. He had been honest. He had said the difficult thing, the thing underneath the prepared thing, and she had received it without cruelty and without false absolution and with the specific clarity of a woman who had been waiting 5 years for someone to say the right wrong thing. He had said, "I was afraid of the answer." She had said, "It does not explain what happened to me." And she was right. Entirely right. The apology, thorough, honest, genuine, had been, in its architecture, still about him. About his fear, his cowardice, his reckoning. He had handed her his self-examination and called it accountability. Accountability, Edmund thought, looking at his untouched accounts, would require him to ask the question he had been managing around for 5 months. What happened to you? Not the outline. Not the known facts, Wiltshire, the school, the evident survival. The actual shape of it. The days after she left. The months. The years. What it had cost. What she had done with the cost. He would ask. He was going to have to become ready to hear the answer. He looked at his study, the room where Mrs. Poole had sat in January and told him the truth, the room where the cold coffee had gone cold, the room where his ordinary Tuesday had ended and something else had begun. He was going to have to become ready. He thought, sitting in the quiet of his study on a cold May afternoon, that he was almost there. She had not cried when she left. This was the thing Cecily remembered most clearly about that November morning, not the words Edmund had said, not the walk down the stairs, not the cold air that had met her at the door of Ravensworth House like an indifferent stranger. She remembered the not crying. The specific physical effort of it, the way she had held herself together from the inside, the way the grey November street had blurred slightly and then unblurred when she blinked it clear. She had told herself she would not cry until she was somewhere that was hers. The problem was that she had nowhere that was hers. Lord Ashby had asked her, once, early in their acquaintance, before it had become what it became, when they were still simply teacher and grateful employer, when she came to his house 3 mornings a week to instruct his younger sister in French and history and the mathematics that young women were not, technically, supposed to need, he had asked her where she was from. Not in the probing way. In the genuine way, the way of a man who was interested in the answer rather than in what the answer might reveal. Cecily had told him, a rectory in Shropshire, her father's parish, a good childhood in a small place. Then her father had died and the rectory had gone with him, as rectories did, and she had needed a position, and she had found one, and she had been in it for 2 years when. She had paused there. Lord Ashby had waited. There was a misunderstanding, she had said. I left the position. I was without references for some time. Lord Ashby had looked at her with the attentive kindness of a man filing something away not for use but for understanding, and had said, "That sounds like a difficult time." Yes, Cecily had said. It was. This was the version she had given. The version that was true in its outline and revealed nothing of its interior, nothing of the 3 weeks she had spent in her father's cousin's house in Surrey, sleeping in the sewing room, listening through the thin wall to her cousin's wife explaining to her husband in a carrying whisper that they couldn't keep her indefinitely, that she had no references, that whatever had happened in that household, well, where there was smoke. She had left before she was asked to. She had gone to London with £4, one good dress, and the education her father had given her, which was the only thing that had never been contingent on anyone else's good opinion. The first year was the hardest. She had known it would be hard, she was not naive, she had understood from the moment she walked out of Ravensworth House that the road ahead was going to require things of her that she was not certain she possessed. What she had not understood was the specific texture of that hardness. The way that doors closed not with hostility but with the quiet efficiency of a world organized around references and connections and the right names, none of which she had. She had taken what work she could find. Copying letters for a solicitor's office, tedious, poorly paid, conducted in a room so cold in winter that she wore her coat at the desk. Private French lessons for the children of a merchant family in Cheapside who paid reliably and asked no questions. A brief, terrible month as a seamstress's assistant, which had ended when it became clear that her eyesight and her patience were both inadequate to the task. She had been hungry twice. Not severely, not the hunger of real deprivation, but the careful hunger of someone managing a very small sum across a very long month, making calculations about bread and coal that she had not previously needed to make. She had not told anyone about the hunger. She had not told anyone about most of it. The school had been Margaret's idea. Margaret Ellison had been a fellow lodger in the Islington boarding house where Cecily had spent her second year in London, a woman of 40, a former governess, sharp-minded and unsentimental and possessed of the particular warmth of someone who has been through a great deal and emerged from it without bitterness, which Cecily had found, at 24 and in the middle of her own difficult passage, genuinely remarkable. "You teach," Margaret had said one evening over their shared supper in the boarding-house kitchen. It was not a question, she had heard Cecily with the merchant's children. "When I can find pupils," Cecily had said. "What would you teach, if you could teach anything?" Cecily had thought about it. "Everything," she had said. "The things girls aren't supposed to need." Margaret had looked at her for a long moment. "I know a woman in Wiltshire," she had said, "who has a building she doesn't know what to do with. The Hartwell School for Girls had opened in Cecily's third year, not Hartwell, in those first months, just the school, a plain name for a plain beginning. 6 students, 2 rooms, Cecily teaching everything and Margaret managing the rest with the efficient authority of a woman who had spent 20 years in other people's houses and was done with that arrangement. It had grown slowly, then quickly, then in the way that things grow when they have found the need they were made to meet. By the 4th year there were 22 students. By the 5th, 30. The woman in Wiltshire had donated a second building. A local physician had begun sending his daughters. A clergyman had written a letter to a newspaper about the school that had brought 3 inquiries from as far as Bath. Cecily had built it from nothing. She had built it from £4 and 1 good dress and the education her father had given her and the cold room in the solicitor's office and the careful hunger and the closing doors and everything that Edmund Vane's cowardice had set in motion. She had built it from all of that. And she was proud of it, genuinely, deeply, the kind of proud that sits in the bones rather than the chest, and she would not have unmade it, would not have traded it away, would not have chosen a different path even if one had been offered. And she was also, when she was honest with herself in the way she had promised herself she would always be honest, still angry. Still carrying the specific anger of someone who had built something extraordinary from wreckage and knew, precisely, who had made the wreck. These 2 things were both true. She had not found a way to reconcile them. She was not certain they could be reconciled. She told Edmund some of this. Not all of it, not the hunger, not the sewing room, not the cousin's wife and her carrying whisper. Those were hers. She had decided, somewhere in the 3rd year, that certain things belonged only to herself, that she would not give them to anyone, not as wounds to be witnessed, not as evidence of suffering, not even as the truth they were. They were hers and she had earned them and she was keeping them. But the school. The school, she told him. It was a week after the West Path, a Wednesday afternoon, a prearranged meeting at the Lending Library on Conduit Street, which was public enough to be proper and quiet enough to be honest. Cecily had chosen it deliberately. Edmund had arrived first, which she noted, and which meant something, though she was not ready yet to examine what. They had found a table in the far corner, near the window overlooking the street, and Edmund had ordered tea that neither of them drank, and Cecily had told him about the school. She had not intended to tell him as much as she told him. This was the difficulty with Edmund Vane. She had discovered it 2 years into her time at Ravensworth House and had not found a solution to it in the 5 years since. He listened in a way that made you want to keep talking. Not because he performed interest, not because he offered the encouraging noises of someone waiting for a pause, but because his attention was real and complete and contained, in its quality, the specific message that what you were saying was worth hearing. She had missed that. She had not allowed herself to miss it, for 5 years. She missed it. She told him about Margaret, and the building in Wiltshire, and the first 6 students who had arrived with varying degrees of reluctance and left at the end of the term with varying degrees of converted enthusiasm. She told him about the physician's daughters and the newspaper letter and the second building. She told him about Miss Hartley, who had joined them in the 4th year and had turned out to be magnificent, and about the student who had written to Cecily 6 months ago to say that she had been accepted to study with a music teacher in London, which was the kind of thing that happened to girls from the school and which still, every time, made Cecily feel something she didn't have a word for. Edmund listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You built that from nothing." "Not nothing," Cecily said. "Margaret." "And before Margaret?" Cecily looked at him. "Before Margaret," she said evenly, "I managed." He held her gaze and she could see him doing the thing she had warned herself he would do, taking the outline she had given him and filling in the parts she hadn't, building the picture from its negative space. He was perceptive and he knew her and she understood, given him enough to reconstruct the shape of it. "The first year," he said quietly. After you left. I managed, Cecily said again. The words were not a door closing, they were simply a boundary, plainly placed. Edmund nodded. He did not push past it. This, she noted, was different from the man she had known 5 years ago. That man had been careful about some things and oblivious about others, with the specific obliviousness of someone who had never needed to notice where the boundaries were because the world had always arranged itself to his preference. This man noticed the boundary and respected it and did not require her to explain it. 5 years, she thought. He had also done 5 years of something. Why did you come back? He asked. To London. This season. Cecily looked out the window at the Conduit Street afternoon, carriages, pedestrians, the ordinary movement of a city that had continued without interruption through her 5 years of difficult passages. Lord Ashby asked me, she said. And before that? Had you considered it? A pause. Every year, she said. Every spring I considered it. And every year I decided, not yet. She looked back at him. And then Lord Ashby asked, and I said yes, and I told myself it was because the school was established and I could leave it for a season without difficulty. She paused. That was true. It was not the whole truth. Edmund looked at her steadily. What was the rest of it? Cecily considered him. This man who had ridden to a card party and closed a door and said I was afraid of the answer, who had listened to her talk about her school with his full and genuine attention, who was sitting across a library table in the lending library on Conduit Street asking her the right question. I was tired, she said at last, of the thing being unfinished. The word sat between them. Unfinished. Not wrong, not painful, not any of the larger words that would have been accurate. Just, unfinished. The word of a woman who had built a school from wreckage and run it with both hands and made her peace with most of it and could not, after 5 years, make her peace with the specific incompleteness of a thing that had never been properly ended. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. And now, he said. Cecily looked at him, really looked at him, without the composed face, without the prepared face, without any of the management she had brought to every previous encounter. Just looked at him, in the quiet of the lending library, with the afternoon light on the table between them. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Edmund nodded. And said, that is the most hopeful thing you've said to me since you walked into my ballroom. Cecily looked at him, startled, and then, despite herself, despite 5 years and everything that 5 years contained, almost amused. You're insufferable, she said. Edmund's mouth curved, not the almost smile, not the social smile, but the real one, the one she had filed away 5 years ago, the one she had told herself she had forgotten. So I've been told, he said. She was in the carriage home when it happened. Lord Ashby was talking, something about the lending library, something about whether they ought to take a subscription, something warm and easy and uncomplicated, and Cecily was listening with half her attention and thinking with the other half about the word unfinished and what she had meant by it and what Edmund had understood by it and what, beneath both of those, she was beginning to understand about herself. She thought about the school. The 30 students and Miss Hartley and the woman in Wiltshire and everything she had built. She thought about Lord Ashby beside her, kind, good, genuinely good, the kind of man who asked where you were from because he wanted to know, who had offered her a position and then a life and had been, in both, entirely trustworthy. She thought about the real smile in the lending library. She thought about sitting across from Edmund Vane in the cold morning and saying you owe me nothing, your grace, and meaning it as a closing, and then finding, in the carriage home, that she was furious. She pressed her hands together in her lap. Lord Ashby glanced at her. All right? Yes, she said. Perfectly. He covered her hands with his, warm, easy, the gesture of a man entirely at peace. Cecily looked at their hands. She thought about what it meant to build something from wreckage. About choosing safety because the alternative had proven dangerous. About the difference between a life that was good and a life that was true, and whether, when you were 30 years old and the wreckage was 5 years behind you, those two things were allowed to be different. She thought about Lord Ashby, who deserved someone whose hands didn't go still when he touched them. She closed her eyes. "I don't know yet," she had said. She was beginning, she thought, in the quiet of the carriage on the London street, to know. Edmund found her the following morning. Not at a party, not at the park, not through the careful social machinery of arranged meetings. He appeared at the house where she and her chaperone were lodging, a correct call, a morning call, entirely proper, and was shown into the sitting room where Cecily was alone, her chaperone having gone out. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "Were you always going to marry him?" he said. No preamble. The question of a man who had spent the night arriving at it. "If I had never found out, if Mrs. Poole had never come to my study, would you have just come to London with him, and married him, and never said a word?" Cecily set down her book. She thought about the answer, the honest answer, the one underneath the careful one. "Yes," she said quietly. "Because it was no longer your story to know, Your Grace. It was mine." Edmund came into the room. He stopped a few feet from her, and looked at her with an expression she had no prepared response to, not the managed look, not the direct look, not any of the looks she had catalogued and filed over 5 years of thinking about this moment. The expression of a man who has run entirely out of careful. "I know," he said. "I know it was yours. I know I have no claim on it. I know that what I did 5 years ago forfeited every right I might have had to stand in this room and say what I am about to say." He held her gaze. "I am going to say it anyway." Cecily said nothing. The sitting room was very quiet. "I have been in love with you," Edmund said, "since the second winter you were in my house. Since the afternoon I stood in the corridor outside the library and heard you read aloud and understood, with the complete clarity of something I had been refusing to understand for months, that I was in very serious trouble." He paused. "I was afraid of it. I managed it. And when Clara gave me a reason to stop managing it and simply end it, I took the reason." Another pause. "I have regretted it every day since I learned the truth. And most of the days before that, if I am being honest." Cecily looked at him. "That is not an apology," she said. "No," he said. "It's a confession. The apology you already have." He held her gaze. "This is the part one couldn't put in a letter." The morning light came through the sitting room window and lay across the floor between them. Cecily thought about the school. About Miss Hartley and the 30 students and what she had built from wreckage. About Lord Ashby and his warm, uncomplicated goodness. About 5 years and what they had cost and what they had made. About standing at the top of his stairs and finding him already looking at her. About unfinished. "You should go," she said. Edmund nodded. He had not expected otherwise. She could see that he had not, that he had come here to say the thing and had not expected the saying of it to resolve anything, had simply needed it said. He turned to leave. "Edmund." He stopped. Cecily looked at him, this man, this complicated and cowardly and unexpectedly honest man, who had been in love with her since the second winter and had buried it badly and paid for the burying and was standing in her sitting room doorway with nothing left to manage. "I need time," she said. "To think. And there are things I need to do first. Before I can." She stopped. "I need time." Edmund looked at her. "I have waited 5 years," he said quietly. "I can wait as long as you need." He left. Cecily sat in the sitting room for a long time after, in the morning light, with her book closed on her lap and her hands very still and the word unfinished turning slowly in her mind like something almost ready to be put down. Almost. Not yet. But almost. She told Lord Ashby that evening. Not all of it, she had promised herself, a long time ago, that certain things belonged only to herself, and the specific interior of what she felt for Edmund Vane was one of those things, too private and too complicated and too unresolved to be handed to another person as an explanation. But enough. Enough for him to understand what she was saying and why she was saying it and what she was asking him, in the saying of it, to receive. She had chosen the garden. Lord Ashby's London house had a small garden at the back, nothing like the grounds of Ravensworth House, nothing like the rose border on the west path, just a modest London square of grass and 2 established trees and a bench that caught the evening sun. She had always liked it. It was the kind of garden that didn't ask anything of you, that simply existed, quietly, and let you exist alongside it. Lord Ashby sat beside her on the bench and listened. He was very still while she talked. This was one of the things she had always valued in him, his stillness. Not the stillness of a man withholding reaction, but the stillness of a man who understood that some things needed space to be said and that space required him to hold himself quietly and let the words arrive in their own time. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The evening light moved through the 2 trees. "How long?" he said at last. Not accusingly, simply asking. The question of a man who needs one fact to complete his understanding. "Since before I knew you," Cecily said. It was already there, when I met you. I thought it was finished. I believed it was finished." She paused. "I was wrong about that." Lord Ashby looked at the garden. "When did you know," he said, "that you were wrong?" Cecily thought about the carriage ride home from the lending library. About her hands going still. About the word unfinished turning in her mind on the dark London street. "Recently," she said. "Honestly, recently. I didn't come to London knowing this. I came to London thinking it was settled. But it wasn't." "No." Another silence. Lord Ashby had very good hands, she had always thought so, large and steady, the hands of a man who built things and fixed things and was reliable in the uncomplicated way that reliable people were reliable. He was looking at them now, in the fading evening light, with an expression that Cecily recognized as the expression of a man doing something genuinely difficult and doing it with grace because grace was simply who he was. "I have known," he said, quietly, to his hands, "for some weeks that something was, not wrong, exactly. Not wrong. But not," he paused. "You were happy with me. I believe that. I don't think you were pretending." "I wasn't," Cecily said. "I want you to know that. I was never pretending. I know." He looked up. "But there is a difference between happy and whole. And I think I have known, for some weeks, that I was not." He stopped. "Tried again. I think I was not the whole of it for you. And I told myself that was enough. That it was enough to be most of it." He was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't enough. Not for me, and, I think not for you, either." "Not really." Cecily looked at him. "You deserve someone," she said, "for whom you are the whole of it." "Yes," he said. Simply. Without self-pity. "I do." They sat in the garden for a while after that, in the way of 2 people who have just navigated something very difficult and are resting on the other side of it. Not unhappily, there was grief in it, real grief, the grief of something genuinely good coming to an end, but without ugliness. Without any of the things that endings could become when the people involved were not careful with each other. Lord Ashby was always careful. It was one of the things she was going to miss most. "Will you be all right?" she asked. He looked at her, and smiled, a real smile, the uncomplicated smile of a genuinely good man who has chosen, in a difficult moment, to be his best self. "I will be all right," he said. "I am quite durable, as it turns out." Cecily felt her throat tighten. "James," she said, his name, his actual name, which she rarely used, which felt now like the right thing to use. "You are one of the finest people I have ever known." "And you," he said, "are the most capable woman I have ever met, and whoever ends up with you had better know that." He stood. Held out his hand. Cecily took it, one last time, the warm steady hand, and then let it go. She did not go to Edmund immediately. She had told him she needed time, and she had meant it, not as a deferral, not as a closing, but as a genuine requirement. There were things to be done, the formal dissolution of the engagement, handled quietly and with dignity on both sides. A letter to Margaret in Wiltshire, which was difficult to write and took 3 evenings. A period of simply sitting with herself, with the decision she had made and what it meant and what came next and whether she was ready. She was not entirely certain what ready meant, in this context. She had been ready, 5 years ago, for something that had not arrived. She had been ready in the way of someone who had not yet learned that readiness was not a protection, that you could be ready and still be broken, still be left standing on a gray November street with nothing in your hands. She had learned it. She was not the same person who had walked out of Ravensworth House. And Edmund Vane was not. She had been paying attention, she had been watching, she was always watching, the same man who had sent her away. Something had changed in him. Not the fundamental architecture, he was still careful, still managed, still the man who wrote 7 letters he didn't send, but underneath that. In the specific quality of what he said when he stopped preparing what to say. In the way he had listened in the lending library. In the way he had appeared at her door and said, "This is the part one couldn't put in a letter." She was not the same. He was not the same. Neither of them was the person who had stood in that corridor 5 years ago, and perhaps that was the point, perhaps that was what unfinished had always meant. Not the end of the old story, but the possibility of a different one. She thought about this for 10 days. On the 11th day, she sent a note to Ravensworth House. He was waiting for her in the garden. Not the ballroom, not the library, not any of the formal rooms of that formal house, the garden, which she had always liked and which he apparently remembered her liking, because when the housekeeper brought her through the house and out the back doors, Edmund was standing on the lawn in the late afternoon sun with his coat on and his hands in his pockets, looking at the roses, and he turned when he heard her and there was no prepared face, no managed expression, no careful social composure. Just him. Cecily walked across the lawn toward him. "You got my note," she said. "Yesterday morning." He looked at her steadily. "I have spent the past 24 hours trying not to read too much into the fact that you sent it." "Did it work?" "No." She almost smiled. "I ended the engagement." Edmund was very still. "I know. Ashby told me." "He told you?" "He came to see me 2 days ago." Something moved across Edmund's face, complicated, layered. "He told me what you had said. That it had been there before you knew him. That it was unfinished." He paused. "He also told me that if I was not, that if I did not," he stopped. "Started again." He was very specific about what he expected of me. "Was he?" Cecily said. "He used the phrase entirely worthy of her 3 times, Edmund said. "I don't think it was accidental." "No," Cecily agreed. "He doesn't do things accidentally." She looked at Edmund, in his garden, in the late afternoon light, in the house where she had spent 2 years of her life and which had been, for 5 years after, a place she could not look at directly, the way you could not look directly at something too bright. She could look at it now. She could look at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Before anything else. Before, whatever this is." Edmund nodded. "Waiting." "I am not the same person I was," Cecily said. "The woman you knew in this house, she was real, but she was also young, and uncertain, and dependent on your household in a way that meant she could not be entirely herself. I was careful. I managed myself." She held his gaze. "I don't do that anymore. I have a school with 30 students and I intend to have 50 by next year, and I have opinions about things and I say them, and I am not going to become careful again for anyone." "I know," Edmund said. "I mean it. Cecily." He said her name, the way he had almost said it at the ball, and she had corrected him back to Miss Hartwell, said it now without asking permission, with a quiet certainty that it was allowed. "I am not asking you to be careful. I am not asking you to manage yourself. I am—" He stopped. The internal argument, she thought, the one she had watched him conduct across dinner tables and card parties and a cold morning on the West Path, arrived finally at its conclusion. "I am asking you to stay. Not in the way you stayed before, not as someone in my household, not at a careful distance, not in the way I was too afraid to ask for properly." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking you to stay as yourself. Entirely. Whatever that is. Whatever that requires of me." He paused. "I know I don't deserve to ask. But I am asking anyway." Cecily looked at him. She thought about the 7 letters he hadn't sent, and the one he had, 4 lines, "I am asking anyway." She thought about the West Path and the lending library and the sitting room doorway. She thought about 5 years and everything they contained, the hunger and the cold room and the school and Miss Hartley and 30 students and everything she had built from the wreckage of a gray November morning. She thought about the word unfinished. She thought about what it meant to be finished. "I have conditions," she said. Something shifted in Edmund's expression, relief, she thought, at the conditions rather than the refusal, at the negotiation rather than the closing. "Name them," he said. "The school continues. Whatever happens, whatever this becomes, the school is mine and it continues, and I will not be asked to reduce my involvement in it." "Of course," he said, without hesitation. "I will not be managed. If you disagree with something I do or say, you will say so directly, to me, and we will discuss it. You will not handle me." "Agreed." "And," she paused, "if you are ever afraid of something, afraid of the answer, afraid of what it will require, you will tell me. Not manage it alone. Not find a clean way out of it. You will tell me." Edmund held her gaze. "That," he said quietly, "is the one that will be most difficult." "I know," Cecily said. "I'm asking anyway." The ghost of a smile, the real one, the unguarded one, crossed his face. "That is mine," he said. "I said that first." "I am aware," Cecily said. "I'm keeping it." He looked at her, standing on his lawn in the late afternoon light, with her conditions plainly stated and her hands steady and nothing of herself managed or careful or held at a distance. "Cecily," he said. "Edmund," she said. He crossed the lawn. She did not step back. He stopped close enough that the late afternoon light held them both, close enough that she could see the specific quality of the expression on his face, the one she had been filing away for 5 years and which was now, finally, allowed to simply be what it was. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the second winter. I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making up for the 5 years I wasted being afraid of it." "You have a great deal of ground to cover," Cecily said. "I am aware," he said. "I intend to be thorough." And Cecily Hartwell, who had walked out of this house with nothing and built something extraordinary from the nothing and come back to London with the specific intention of finishing an unfinished thing, looked at Edmund Vane in his garden in the late afternoon light and felt, for the first time in 5 years, the specific sensation of something clicking into place. Not the safety of Lord Ashby's warmth. Not the careful managed thing of 2 years in this house. Something different. Something that had always been there, underneath the management and the cowardice and the grey November morning and the 5 years of burying, something that had, like her great-grandmother's roses, survived because nobody had thought to tell it that it shouldn't. She reached out and took his hand. Later, much later, when the late afternoon had become evening and the garden had gone to a soft blue dusk and they had been talking, really talking, for hours in the way they had never quite been allowed to talk before, Edmund said, "What will you do about the school? The season ends in 6 weeks. Go back to Wiltshire," Cecily said. "There are things that need my attention before September." "And after September?" She looked at him. "That," she said, "depends on how thorough you intend to be." Edmund looked at her, the real smile, fully deployed, entirely unguarded, the smile of a man who has spent 5 years being careful and has just decided, completely and without reservation, to stop. "Very," he said. The second spring ball at Ravensworth House was Edmund's idea. Cecily had raised an eyebrow when he suggested it. They were at breakfast, she with her correspondence from the school spread across her half of the table in the way that still made the Ravensworth housekeeper quietly despair, he with the Morning Post folded to the parliamentary section which he was not reading, and she had said, "Another ball? You told me last year that balls were the most efficiently miserable social obligation in existence." "They are," Edmund had said. "This one will be different." "How?" He had looked at her over the unread Morning Post with the expression she had come to think of as his most honest expression, not the managed look, not the social look, but the one that arrived when he had stopped thinking about how he looked and was simply looking. "You'll be there from the beginning," he had said. Instead of walking into the middle of it. Cecily had looked at him for a moment. Then she had gone back to her correspondence and said, "Fine. But I'm not standing by any windows." 2 years had passed since the garden. They had been, Cecily thought, sitting at her dressing table on the evening of the ball while her maid dressed her hair, honest years. Not easy, not uncomplicated, not the smooth untroubled passage of two people for whom everything had resolved cleanly and stayed resolved. Honest. The years of two people who had come to each other with histories and habits and the specific grooves worn by 5 years of separate difficult passages, learning, with varying degrees of success and occasional spectacular failure, how to be in the same life. Edmund had been afraid of things and told her so. 3 times in the first year, twice in the second, each time with the particular difficulty of a man for whom this did not come naturally and who was doing it anyway because he had promised. Each time Cecily had listened and they had discussed it and it had been, without exception, better than the alternative would have been. Cecily had been angry sometimes, not the buried fury of the 5 years before, but the present, honest anger of a woman who had conditions and expected them to be met and said so when they weren't. Edmund had been, without exception, better at receiving this than she had anticipated. He did not handle her. He did not manage the anger. He sat with it, and heard it, and responded to it directly, and this had surprised her every time for approximately the first 8 months before she had accepted that it was simply who he had decided to become. She had not expected to admire him. She had expected, love, yes, in whatever complicated form it was going to take. She had not expected to admire him. To watch him do a difficult thing and think, there it is, there is the man underneath the managed version, and he is better than I gave him credit for. She found she was frequently revising her credit upward. It was, all things considered, a good problem to have. The school had 38 students. Miss Hartley had taken on 2 additional teachers, a young woman from Edinburgh who taught mathematics with evangelical enthusiasm, and a former governess of 40 who taught literature and cried, reliably, at the end of every term when the students went home, which the students found both baffling and deeply endearing. Cecily went to Wiltshire every 6 weeks. Edmund had come twice, the first time to see it, the second time because she had mentioned offhandedly that the east classroom roof needed attention, and he had appeared 3 days later with a recommendation for a builder and an expression that dared her to comment on it. She had not commented on it. She had shown him the east classroom and the mathematics teacher and the literature teacher and the students, and he had walked through all of it with his full and genuine attention and had said, at the end of the afternoon, standing in the school garden while the Edinburgh teacher argued cheerfully with a student about Euclid in the window above them, "You built this from nothing." "You keep saying that," Cecily had said. "I keep meaning it," he had said. The ball began at 9. Cecily stood at the top of the stairs, the same ballroom below, the same chandelier casting the same warm indifferent light over the same crowd of London faces, and felt the specific quality of standing in a place that had once been the site of something difficult and finding that the difficulty had been so thoroughly superseded that it was now simply a place. Her stairs, now. Her ballroom. Edmund appeared beside her. He looked at her, the way he looked at her now, without management, without the careful cataloguing distance of 2 years in this house and 5 years of burying, just directly, the way you look at someone you have chosen and intend to keep choosing. "Ready?" he said. Cecily looked at the ballroom, the room she had walked into 2 years ago with her composed face and her prepared expression and her specific intention of finishing an unfinished thing. The room where she had stood by the window with an untouched glass of champagne and given him nothing and felt, in the carriage home, the hot present fury of someone whose wound had just been prodded back into feeling. She thought about what she had said to him in his study, the afternoon of her first arrival, 11 years ago now in another life, "A poor relation finds ways to occupy herself, Your Grace." No, that was Eleanor. That was the other story. She almost smiled. She thought about the school. About Miss Hartley and 38 students and the Edinburgh mathematician and the literature teacher who cried. About the roof Edmund had fixed without being asked and the way he listened and the 7 letters he hadn't sent and the 1 4-line letter he had and the garden in the dusk and I am asking anyway. She thought about her father's rectory in Shropshire and the £4 and the cold room in the solicitor's office and the careful hunger that had been hers and that she was keeping, along with everything else that had made her who she was. She thought about standing at the top of these stairs 2 years ago, with Lord Ashby's arm under her hand, and finding Edmund already looking at her. She took Edmund's arm. "I have been ready," she said, "for a very long time." Norris announced them from the bottom of the stairs. The Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth. The name moved through the ballroom, her name now, the name she had walked into this house without 2 years ago, the name that London had discussed in its particular way for 1 season and then accepted with the pragmatic efficiency of a city that had more interesting things to move on to. Heads turned. The crowd parted slightly, naturally, the way crowds parted for people who belonged. Cecily walked down the stairs beside Edmund and felt, not triumph, not the vindication she might have imagined, once, when she had stood on a grey November street with nothing in her hands and imagined all the things that might someday make it mean something. Something quieter than triumph. Something that sat in the bones. Here, she thought. Here is the finished thing. Lord Ashby arrived at 9:30. He came with a woman on his arm, a widow from Hampshire, bright-eyed and direct, who laughed loudly at her own jokes and appeared to find Lord Ashby's uncomplicated warmth exactly as wonderful as it was. He had written to Cecily about her in March with the careful understatement of a man trying not to seem as happy as he was, and Cecily had written back with the direct delight of a woman who was genuinely, unreservedly glad. She saw him across the ballroom and he saw her. He smiled, the real smile, wide and uncomplicated. She smiled back. Edmund, beside her, said nothing. But she felt his hand, at the small of her back, steady and present, and she knew he had seen the exchange and understood it and was, in his way, grateful for the fact of Lord Ashby's goodness, which had made all of this possible to navigate with something other than wreckage. "You are one of the finest people I have ever known," she had told him in his garden. She still believed it. Later in the evening, Cecily found herself standing by the windows. Not hiding. Not positioning herself with a clear sight line to the door, not composing a face, not managing herself against anything. Simply standing, with a glass of champagne she was actually drinking this time, looking out at the garden where the roses were beginning their second season under her watch, fuller now, more established, beginning to understand that the conditions were good and that they could, if they chose, be extraordinary. Edmund found her. He always found her. "The roses," he said, coming to stand beside her. "They're better this year. They'll be better still next year. You don't know that." "I have been reliably informed," he said, "by my groundskeeper, who is still inexplicably proud of the early bloom, that the conditions are excellent." "Your groundskeeper," Cecily said, "has very strong opinions about roses for a man whose primary responsibility is the drainage on the north field. He is a man of varied enthusiasms." She looked at the garden. "Edmund." "Yes." "Are you happy?" She had not planned to ask it, it had arrived, as the honest question sometimes did, without advance notice. She felt him still beside her, the specific quality of his stillness when something had genuinely landed. Then he turned from the garden and looked at her, and she turned and looked at him, and what was on his face was so completely and immediately an answer that the question felt, in retrospect, almost unnecessary. Almost. She had needed to hear it anyway. "Yes," he said. Quietly. Without qualification or management or the careful layering of a man who has spent his life in the considered deployment of words. Just, yes. The most undefended word she had ever heard him say. Cecily looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the garden and took a sip of her champagne and said, "Good. I am also happy. I thought you should know." Edmund was quiet for a beat. "The most romantic declaration I have ever received," he said, "was just delivered in the tone one uses to report on the North Field drainage. I am a practical woman." "You are," he agreed. "It is one of approximately 40 things I love about you." Cecily looked at him. He looked back at her with the real smile, fully deployed, entirely unguarded, the smile that had once been filed away and was now simply always available, always there, always his. She felt it, as she always felt it, in the specific place in her chest where the composure used to live. The ball went on around them. Music, voices, the warm machinery of a London evening doing what London evenings did, indifferent, as always, to the specific weight of what was being felt at the windows by the garden. London did not care about the 5 years or the grey November morning or the 7 unsent letters or the school with 38 students or the word unfinished that had turned in the dark of a carriage and brought Cecily back to this city and this house and this man. London simply kept moving. Which was, Cecily thought, as it should be. The story had not been London's. It had been hers. She had finished it herself. A note on what came after. The Hartwell School for Girls reached 50 students the following autumn, as Cecily had promised herself it would. The Edinburgh mathematician stayed for 11 years. The literature teacher cried at the end of every term for the rest of her career and considered this no reason for embarrassment whatsoever. Lord Ashby married his Hampshire widow in October. It was, by all accounts, an extremely cheerful wedding. He danced at the reception for 4 consecutive hours and showed no signs of stopping. Edmund attended every session of Parliament that year and came home from London as early as the business would allow. He developed, over time, genuinely strong opinions about roses, to the quiet vindication of his groundskeeper. Cecily kept the things that were hers, the hunger, the cold room, the careful £4, all of it. Not as wounds. As the record of what she had been capable of, when the world had offered her nothing and she had made something from it anyway. She told her students about it sometimes, not the details, but the shape of it. That difficult things could be survived. That survival was not the same as thriving, but that it was the necessary first step. That what you built from wreckage was no less real for having started as wreckage. They listened. Some of them, years later, told their own students. This is how things that were almost lost become, instead, the kind of thing that lasts. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.